The southern forest near the capital city was suddenly thrown into chaos. Birds, sensing an imminent threat, called out in panic to one another, seeking refuge among the dense foliage, their tiny hearts pounding in fear. Every creature, from the swift-footed deer to the fierce tigers and leopards, whispered to one another a terrifying piece of news. The king was coming to hunt. King Kaloi was coming. Unlike the usual hunting expeditions, this one was of an entirely different scale. The king had orchestrated a grand hunt set to last an entire week. This endeavor, however, had another hidden purpose beyond mere sport. It was meant to diminish the growing influence of a revered ascetic monk residing deep within this very forest. The hunting party arrived at the forest's edge, resembling an army preparing for battle. Their arsenal was vast: bows and arrows, gleaming swords, and sharp spears, all meticulously arranged for swift action. Along with them came a dedicated unit to manage food supplies and an efficient system of messengers to relay orders. They erected tents and prepared accommodations for the king's rest. At the head of this formidable assembly was King Kaloi himself, astride a majestic white steed. Clad in a warrior's attire tailored for ease of movement, he was the embodiment of royal authority and unyielding ambition. His love for the thrill of the chase, for the danger and excitement it brought, shone most brilliantly in moments like these. The party ventured deeper into the forest. Each time the king successfully brought down an animal with a precise shot, his men erupted into triumphant cheers. A dedicated group immediately retrieved the fallen creature and presented it before him. "Your Majesty," the arrow struck straight through the beast's skull with perfect precision. "Your Majesty, you have felled the most magnificent stag in all the forest." "Your Majesty," the king accepted these praises with a satisfied smile, exuding confidence and authority. As a gesture of reward, he commanded feasts and celebrations for his warriors. By midday, the hunt was momentarily halted. The king reclined in a hammock, indulging in a brief respite. However, upon waking, he was bewildered to find that many of his men were missing. Where had they gone? His brows furrowed in suspicion. Before he could demand answers, a messenger arrived in haste, breathless and anxious. "Your Majesty, the soldiers, they have gathered under a Bodhi tree to listen to a wandering monk preach." The king's fury ignited instantly. For some time now, rumors had spread of this monk's growing influence, even among members of the royal court. The king had initiated this grand hunt precisely to uncover the truth. And now the very thing he had sought to investigate was happening before his eyes, his own soldiers abandoning their duty, enchanted by the monk's words. A sharp command rang through the air, summoning the absent men back at once. But they did not return. The king's thoughts darkened. Could it be that this monk had bewitched them, ensnaring their minds through some mystical trickery? His anger burned hotter. With a swift motion, he mounted his horse and rode off at full speed, his loyal guards following in tight formation. They neared the gathering spot. The king's most trusted attendants, sensing his growing rage, spurred their horses ahead. Their voices cut through the still air, shouting commands to disperse the assembly. The soldiers, jolted out of their trance, turned to face their enraged ruler. Moments ago, they had listened to a sermon about compassion and mercy, words that made them question the violence of their hunt. Now, they stood torn between their loyalty to the king and the truth they had just begun to understand. The king dismounted. He moved forward, his gaze locked on the figure seated serenely beneath the tree. Before he could approach, his attendants rushed to his side. "Your Majesty, there is no need for you to soil your hands dealing with this insolent ascetic. Grant us the honor of removing him at once." Without waiting for the king's response, they advanced on the monk, their voices dripping with venom. They hurled insults, vile and cruel, their words designed to provoke, to humiliate. Their threats grew harsher as they sought to shatter the monk's composure. But the monk remained unshaken. He did not flinch, nor did he respond. He was a stone in the storm, an ocean undisturbed by raging winds. The king's eyes narrowed in curiosity. Every man he had encountered had always bowed before him, their voices trembling as they hailed him with reverence. But this monk, this lone man, sat unmoved, unfazed. With measured steps, the king approached. His voice rang with authority. "You, stubborn monk, why do you sit here so fearlessly? What is it that you seek?" The ascetic lifted his gaze, his expression serene. His voice was gentle, yet unwavering. "Your Majesty, I am a practitioner of patience and endurance." The king frowned. "Patience and endurance? What do you mean by that?" The monk's voice carried the same calm certainty as before. "To cultivate patience is to let go of pride and arrogance. It is to reject cruelty and embrace humility. To endure is to speak only words of kindness, to hold no hatred in one's heart, and to guide others toward peace." The king's hands clenched into fists. The monk's words, though peaceful, felt like arrows striking at his temper. To him, this was no mere lesson. It was a deliberate attack on his impulsive nature. He could no longer contain his outrage. "Enough! Cease your deceitful talk." He turned sharply, about to command his guards to act. But then, as if struck by a sudden thought, he pivoted back toward the monk, his voice quieter, yet laced with suspicion. "Tell me this. When my men insulted you just now, when they rained down curses upon you, why did you remain silent? Why did you not respond?" The monk smiled slightly, his eyes unwavering. "Your Majesty, if their words were true, I would take them to heart and seek to change my ways. But if they were false, why should I let them trouble me? Words spoken in malice, when unheeded, disappear like echoes in the wind. I hold no anger toward them." A ripple of astonishment spread through the gathering. The soldiers exchanged glances, their admiration evident. Even the king's attendants, so eager to strike moments before, now stood in silent disbelief. The king, however, felt something far different. His pride had been wounded. He could not allow his authority to be so easily undermined. His jaw tightened. With a swift motion, he unsheathed his gleaming sword. "These are the words of a cunning trickster. Such insolence cannot be tolerated." The king's hand descended with swift finality, and in an instant, the blade's merciless edge severed both ears of the sage. A crimson flow began to trickle down, staining his cheeks in rivulets of blood. A heavy silence fell over the assembled court, each soul gripped by a mixture of awe and dread. Yet despite the harrowing pain that would have driven most men to cries of agony, the sage remained seated in tranquil meditation. His expression was undisturbed, his countenance a testament to an unfathomable resilience. There was no hint of anger, no flicker of resentment in his eyes. The king, Kaloi Vung, narrowed his gaze, astonishment flickering in the depths of his mind. What manner of man could endure such torment without so much as a grimace? Was this ascetic imbued with mystical powers? Could he be some sort of sorcerer? And yet, the king's pride and wrath would not permit him to retreat now. His grip on his sword tightened, his resolve hardening. If this man's patience knew no bounds, then he would push it further. With a decisive motion, he swung the weapon once more, slicing through the sage's hands as they rested before his chest in serene prayer. "Let us see just how deep his endurance runs," the king bellowed, his voice a mixture of challenge and curiosity. Fresh torrents of blood spilled onto the ground, forming a dark, glistening pool around the sage's seated form. Still, the man did not waver. His breath remained steady, his posture unmoved. If anything, the clarity in his eyes grew more profound, a radiant light of compassion shining forth. His face, unmarred by the pain that should have consumed him, exuded an indescribable gentleness, like a soothing rain extinguishing the raging flames of vengeance and cruelty. The king's fury began to wane, giving way to an emotion he had not expected: doubt. Who was this man? How could he remain so unwaveringly calm in the face of such brutality? Was he truly a being beyond ordinary understanding? The weight of the silence pressed upon the gathered soldiers, their anticipation thick in the air. Finally, the king spoke again, his voice betraying the faintest tremor of hesitation. "Tell me, O sage, how can you endure such torment without even the shadow of rage in your heart?" Slowly, the sage lifted his wounded arms, the fresh stumps where his hands had once been dripping crimson upon his robes. Yet his voice, when it came, was as steady as a mountain against the storm. "O great king, if I had indeed committed a wrong and were now receiving punishment, I would accept it as if I were drinking the sweetest nectar, and I would bow with reverence before the one who administers it. However, if harm is inflicted upon me without justice or cause, I reflect upon the workings of karma. Perhaps in a time long past I had sown the seeds of misdeeds that now ripen into my suffering. Furthermore, I do not see this body as anything more than a fleeting illusion, a temporary vessel. Why then should I cling to it with sorrow or regret? A strange sensation took hold of the king. Shame coiled within him, an unfamiliar, heavy burden pressing upon his chest. And yet, his mind, accustomed to scrutinizing and doubting, sought further confirmation. "Well spoken. Your reasoning is admirable indeed," he conceded. "But words alone cannot prove the purity of your heart. How shall I be convinced that there truly is no hatred within you? How shall I believe that you hold no resentment toward me or my court, who have treated you with such cruelty?" The sage's gaze, profound as the depths of the ocean, met the king's searching eyes. He raised his maimed arms, his expression serene, and declared with unwavering conviction, "I vow before all that exists, my heart bears no anger, no bitterness. Those who have harmed me do so only because they are shrouded in the veils of ignorance. They, too, are suffering, though they may not yet realize it. If my words do not align with the purity of my heart, then let my wounds fester, let my body wither in agony. But if my soul is truly free from hatred, then may these wounds heal, whole and unblemished." A great tremor passed through the earth, as though the heavens themselves bore witness to the truth of his words. An exquisite fragrance filled the air, carried upon an invisible breeze, soothing and divine. The eyes of all present widened in disbelief as they beheld a miracle unfolding before them. Before their very gaze, the sage's mutilated body began to mend itself. The severed hands, the lacerated ears, all restored, as if untouched by violence. A luminous radiance enveloped him, and he sat beneath the sacred Bodhi tree, his form exuding a profound serenity that silenced even the hardest of hearts. The king fell to his knees. His once proud spirit, bolstered by arrogance and fleeting power, crumbled in the presence of something infinitely greater. Tears, unchecked and sincere, traced paths down his cheeks as he pressed his forehead to the blood-stained ground before the sage. "Forgive me," he implored, his voice hoarse with sorrow. "I have been blind, consumed by my own ignorance and pride. From this day forth, I vow to cherish this lesson of patience and endurance, not only in my rule but in the depths of my very being. May this wisdom guide me in all my lives to come, and may I dedicate myself wholly to the path of righteousness." With quiet grace, the sage reached out, lifting the humbled king to his feet. His touch was gentle, his eyes kind. "Your heart's awakening has already washed away your misdeeds," he said softly. "And I promise you this, when the time comes, when I have attained supreme enlightenment, you shall be my first disciple." This sage, a beacon of wisdom and compassion, was none other than the previous incarnation of the Buddha himself, and the humbled king, Kaloi Vung, would one day be reborn as Kyo Chun Yu, the first disciple to receive the teachings of the Enlightened One. True to his promise, after 49 years of ceaseless guidance, the Buddha's first sermon at the Deer Park in Sarnath would be imparted to none other than his former adversary, now transformed into a devoted seeker of truth.